What makes a killer's lie so convincing? Is it the way they say it, the way they look you in the eye without a single flicker of doubt, or is it because deep down we want to believe them? Some of history's most dangerous murderers were not the shadowy figures lurking in dark alleys. No, they were the ones who smiled, who shook hands, who made people feel safe right before they took their lives. Think about it. If a complete stranger approached you in distress, asking for help, would you stop to assist them? Most of us would. It's human nature, and killers know that. They exploit our trust, our kindness, our assumptions, all to get what they want. Today, we expose some of history's most deceptive killers, the ones who hid in plain sight, the ones who manipulated, misled, and covered their tracks with chilling precision. By the end of this video, you might start questioning everything you thought you knew about human deception. Are you ready? How can a man responsible for dozens of brutal murders be described as charming? Ted Bundy wasn't the type of killer who lurked in shadows. He didn't need to. He used his charm, his looks, and his intelligence to make sure no one ever suspected him. And his trick, playing the perfect gentleman. Bundy faked injuries, wore casts, used crutches, making himself look vulnerable, harmless. He would struggle with books, pretend to drop his keys, or act like he needed help getting something into his car. And when a kind-hearted woman stepped forward to help, that was when she made her last mistake. Would you have been fooled? Many were, too many, and it cost them their lives. When Bundy was finally caught, even the judge who sentenced him to death expressed admiration for his intelligence and charisma. Imagine that a killer so convincing that even in the face of undeniable evidence, people still saw something likable in him. That's the terrifying thing about deception. Sometimes the most dangerous people are the ones who seem the safest. Could your friendly neighbor be a serial killer? Dennis Rader, better known as the BTK killer short for bind, torture, kill, didn't look like a monster. In fact, he looked like a model citizen. He was a husband, a father, a church president, even a Cub Scout leader. But behind closed doors, he was one of the most sadistic killers in history. For decades, Rader toyed with police. He sent letters describing his crimes in disturbing detail, mocking investigators for failing to catch him. He wanted the world to know what he had done, but on his terms. And the scariest part, no one suspected him. When he was finally caught in 2005, his family was in complete shock. His own wife and children had no idea they had been living with a cold-blooded serial killer. How did he get away with it for so long? Simple. He blended in. And that's the most terrifying deception of all. Because if someone like him could live undetected for decades, manipulating those closest to him, who else is out there hiding behind a mask? Can a TV show turn someone into a murderer? For most people, watching a crime show is just entertainment. But for Mark Twitchell, it became an obsession. Twitchell was fascinated by Dexter, the hit TV series about a forensic expert who secretly moonlights as a vigilante serial killer. But Twitchell didn't just watch the show, he tried to live it. His plan was disturbingly elaborate. He created a fake online dating profile, posing as a woman to lure unsuspecting men to his garage in Edmonton, Canada. But this wasn't just any garage. Twitchell had converted it into a kill room complete with plastic sheets and a metal table just like Dexter. And if that's not chilling enough, he kept a detailed journal documenting his crimes, writing in the third person, as if he were the star of his own twisted show. But unlike Dexter, Twitchell wasn't a genius. He slipped up, and his mistakes led police straight to him. When investigators searched his computer, they found a document titled SK Confessions. SK stood for Serial Killer. Inside, a step-by-step breakdown of his murder attempts, detailing his thoughts, emotions, and failures. Twitchell's fantasy world came crashing down when one of his intended victims fought back and escaped, going straight to the police. His obsession with fiction turned into reality, and reality sent him straight to prison for life. Why would a serial killer admit to their crimes only to lie about the details? For Keith Jesperson, also known as the Happy Face Killer, deception wasn't just a means to an end, it was an addiction. Jesperson was a long-haul truck driver, which gave him the perfect cover. He could kill in one state, then disappear into another. His crimes might have gone unnoticed if not for his desperate need for attention. After his first known murder in 1990, two innocent people were falsely convicted for the crime. But instead of keeping quiet, Jesperson couldn't stand that someone else was getting credit for his work. So he did something unusual. He started leaving taunting confessions, signing them with a simple, eerie smiley face, earning him the nickname the Happy Face Killer. But here's the twist: he exaggerated many of his murders. Why? Because for some killers, the crime isn't enough. They need the story, the power, the legend. Jesperson loved the spotlight, feeding investigators a mix of truths, half-truths, and complete fabrications. He wanted control not just over his victims, but over how he was remembered. To this day, authorities believe he may have claimed more victims than we know. And the question remains, how many of his confessions were real, and how many were just another lie? How do killers use love as a weapon? Raymond Fernandez and Martha Beck weren't just murderers, they were con artists, using romance as bait. Their scheme was simple. They placed personal ads in Lonely Hearts columns, targeting women who were desperate for love. Fernandez, smooth talking and charismatic, would woo these women, making them feel special. But he wasn't working alone. His jealous and possessive partner, Martha Beck, was always nearby. Once they gained their victims' trust, the duo would rob, swindle, and eventually murder them. In some cases, Beck's uncontrollable jealousy led to killings even when murder wasn't part of the plan. If she felt a victim was getting too close to Fernandez, she would snap. Their trail of deception and murder finally came to an end in 1949, when a mother and daughter they lured into their trap were found dead. And in the ultimate twist of irony, the people who spent their lives using love to manipulate others ended up falling for each other. Even when they were sentenced to death, they held hands, professing their love in the courtroom. Love, in their case, was a deadly illusion. How can love be weaponized as a tool for murder? For Raymond Fernandez and Martha Beck, love wasn't about romance, it was a trap. They weren't just con artists, they were predators and their prey, lonely, vulnerable women searching for companionship. Fernandez was the bait, charming, charismatic, and persuasive. He placed ads in newspapers' Lonely Hearts columns, promising love to women desperate for attention. But once he had them hooked, the real danger began. To the victims, Fernandez was a dream come true, a dashing, affectionate man ready to sweep them off their feet. What they didn't know was that Martha Beck was watching. Beck was madly in love with Fernandez, but jealousy burned inside her. She couldn't stand seeing him with other women, and the result, it turned deadly. To keep the charade alive, they posed as siblings, with Fernandez seducing his victims while Beck played the role of his protective sister. But as soon as the women let their guard down, the couple struck. At first, their crimes were about money, stealing from their victims and disappearing. But Beck's jealous rage turned them into killers. If she felt a woman was getting too close to Fernandez, she snapped. One victim was drowned in a bathtub. Another was beaten to death with a hammer. The duo was spiraling out of control, but eventually their lies caught up with them. When they murdered a mother and daughter together, the police finally closed in. In a shocking twist, even as they were sentenced to death, Fernandez and Beck declared their love for each other. Even in the face of execution, Beck had only one wish: to die alongside the man she adored. Love can blind people, but in this case, it turned deadly. Can social media be a platform for boasting about crimes? Some killers hide in shame, others, they brag. And that's exactly what Mohammed El Aboud and Qusay Al Jundi did. Their crime: the brutal murder of 72-year-old Louise Cam in a greedy scheme to steal £4.6 million. Their method: deception. They tricked Cam into signing over valuable property, making her believe she was making a smart investment. But once they had what they wanted, they strangled her to death, stuffed her body in a bin, and dumped it in the back of a house. Now, most criminals would lay low after a murder, right? Not these two. Instead, they went straight to TikTok. In a move that defies all logic, they posted videos celebrating, dancing, laughing, and flaunting their wealth while Cam's body was still hidden. Why? Because they thought they got away with it. What they didn't realize was that their arrogance would be their downfall. Police were already closing in, and when detectives uncovered CCTV footage of them carrying out the crime, it was over. Both men were convicted, and their own social media posts became evidence against them. This case proves one terrifying fact: technology has changed crime forever. For killers like these, social media wasn't just a platform, it was a stage. And in the end, their need for attention cost them their freedom. Is it possible for someone to orchestrate a murder without ever getting their hands dirty? Sharon Graham, a suburban grandmother, never touched a weapon. She never pulled a trigger, never strangled anyone. Yet she engineered a brutal murder with nothing but words. Her target? Bruce Saunders, her ex-partner. Her motive? Money. Graham saw an opportunity, a life insurance payout worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. But instead of carrying out the crime herself, she did something far more chilling. She manipulated two men into doing it for her. One was her current fiancé. The other, a former lover who still adored her. She played them against each other, convincing them that Saunders had to die, and they listened. The plan was gruesome. One night, Saunders was knocked unconscious, and his body was fed into an industrial woodchipper to make it look like a tragic accident. And it almost worked. For months, the police believed it was an accident. Graham nearly walked away scot-free. But greed is a dangerous thing. When authorities started looking deeper, the cracks in her story began to show. The killers turned on each other, and when investigators discovered the truth, Graham's web of lies collapsed. She had never lifted a finger. But make no mistake, she was the real killer. Because sometimes the deadliest weapon isn't a knife or a goonet's manipulation. What drives individuals to deceive others so profoundly? Is it desperation, survival, or something far more sinister? For many killers, deception isn't just a tool, it's a way of life. They lie not just to cover their crimes, but because it gives them a sense of power. The key psychological factors behind deception: a desire for control. Some killers thrive on manipulating their victims and the people around them. The ability to deceive others makes them feel powerful. A lack of empathy. The ability to lie without remorse is common among psychopaths and narcissists. They see people as tools, not human beings. A need for dominance. Deception can be a way for killers to toy with law enforcement, believing they are always one step ahead. Take Dennis Rader, the BTK killer. For decades, he taunted police with letters detailing his crimes. He didn't just want to kill, he wanted people to know it was him. Or Keith Jesperson, the happy face killer. He left confessions behind, signing them with smiley faces as if it were all a game. And what about Ted Bundy? His entire persona was a carefully crafted lie. His victims never saw the monster lurking behind his polite smile. For killers like these, deception wasn't just about hiding the truth. It was about controlling the narrative. Because in their minds, as long as they could make people believe their lies, they were untouchable. How do killers gain the trust of their victims? It's a terrifying question because the answer is simple. They make themselves seem safe. Serial killers don't look like monsters. They don't jump out of dark alleys wearing masks. Most of them, they blend in. They use charm, intelligence, and psychological manipulation to disarm their victims. Ted Bundy is a perfect example. He didn't chase women through the streets. Instead, he pretended to be injured, wearing a fake cast or using crutches so that his victims would feel compelled to help him. And it worked over and over again. But Bundy wasn't alone in his deception. Rodney Alcala, the so-called dating game killer, won a spot on a TV dating show. He seemed charming, funny, even likable. The woman who chose him for a date, she backed out at the last second. She felt something was off, and that decision may have saved her life. John Wayne Gacy, the killer clown, was a well-liked businessman who dressed up as a clown for children's parties. But behind closed doors, he was one of the most sadistic murderers in history. The scariest part, these men weren't just good at lying, they were masters of human psychology. Because once someone trusts you, they let their guard down. And for killers like Bundy, Alcala, and Gacy, that moment was all they needed. How does deception hinder criminal investigations? For law enforcement, every second counts in catching a killer. But what happens when the killer themselves is feeding investigators false information? It can delay justice for years, sometimes decades. Dennis Rader, the BTK killer, was an expert at this. He didn't just evade police, he toyed with them. For years, he sent taunting letters pretending to leave clues, but really leading investigators down dead ends. And it worked. It wasn't until 2005, 30 years after his first known murder, that he made a fatal mistake. He sent a floppy disk to the police, thinking they couldn't trace it. But they did. Then there's the case of Israel Keyes, one of the most terrifying serial killers in modern history. Keyes had no pattern, no connection between his victims. He buried kill kits containing weapons and tools across the country, sometimes years before he struck. And when he was finally caught, he lied, over and over again. He refused to give police details about his crimes. He fed them misinformation to keep them off track. And worst of all, he took secrets to his grave when he killed himself in prison. His deception worked. To this day, authorities don't know the full extent of his crimes. And that's the danger of a killer who knows how to lie. They don't just manipulate their victims, they manipulate the system itself. What happens when killers can't keep their stories straight? Interrogators know one universal truth. A liar's worst enemy is themselves. It's easy to tell one lie, but to keep that lie consistent across days, weeks, and multiple interrogations, that's where things start to fall apart. And for many criminals, their own contradictions are what bring them down. Take Chris Watts, the Colorado man who murdered his wife and two daughters in 2018. When investigators first questioned him, he acted devastated, confused, and desperate to find his missing family. He gave a carefully rehearsed statement, insisting he had no idea where they were. But under pressure, his lies unraveled. Investigators noticed the inconsistencies. He claimed he left for work early, but home security footage showed his truck parked longer than he said. He said his wife was still in bed, but her phone, keys, and shoes were still at home. His emotions didn't match his words. He looked uncomfortable, detached, and almost rehearsed. Then came the polygraph test. "You failed," the examiner told him, "and you already knew that." That was the moment his lies cracked. In a panic, he changed his story. At first, he blamed his wife. Then the truth finally spilled out. He had strangled her, he had killed their children, and he had dumped their bodies in an oil tank. His deception might have worked if not for his inability to keep his lies straight. And that's the thing about deception. No matter how well you prepare, the truth has a way of surfacing. How many times have we heard this? "He was such a nice guy. She didn't seem like a killer." But deception is powerful, and sometimes we ignore the signs until it's too late. Look at Jeffrey Dahmer. His neighbors reported strange smells, screams, and suspicious behavior. But when police visited his apartment, he was so calm and polite that they believed him over the victims. Or take John Wayne Gacy. He was a respected businessman, performed as a clown at children's parties, and was known for helping his community. No one suspected that dozens of bodies were buried beneath his house. Why? Because he seemed normal. Even Rodney Alcala, the dating game killer, appeared charming enough to win a spot on a national TV dating show, all while being an active serial killer. People saw red flags but ignored them. Neighbors heard screaming but dismissed it. Friends noticed odd behavior but laughed it off. Police had opportunities to investigate but let them go. And the lesson: we ignore red flags at our own risk, because the scariest killers are the ones who can make us believe they are safe. Some killers go to extreme lengths to keep their secrets. They don't just lie, they stage entire crime scenes. They blame others, plant false evidence, even cry in front of cameras, hoping the world will see them as victims. One of the most infamous cases, Scott Peterson. In 2002, when his pregnant wife, Laci Peterson, went missing, Scott played the role of the devastated husband. He held press conferences, pleaded for her safe return, cried on TV. But behind the scenes, he was lying the entire time. Investigators discovered that he had a secret mistress, Amber Frey. He told Amber he was a widower before Laci was even missing. He changed his story multiple times when questioned. Eventually, police found Laci's body in the same bay where Scott claimed he had gone fishing. His fake innocence had cracks, and those cracks exposed him. And he's not alone. Casey Anthony, accused of murdering her daughter, created a web of lies that kept investigators spinning in circles. Jodi Arias, convicted of killing her ex-boyfriend, put on a tearful act, claiming self-defense until her own contradictions destroyed her case. Oscar Pistorius, the famous South African athlete, claimed he accidentally shot his girlfriend, Reva Steenkamp, but forensic evidence told a different story. The more elaborate the lie, the more terrifying the truth. Because if someone is willing to fake grief, plant evidence, and stage crime scenes, what else are they capable of? Every liar makes one mistake. It might not happen right away, some get away with it for years, even decades, but eventually they slip. Some killers get so comfortable in their deception that they start taunting the police, believing they are too smart to be caught. And history proves one thing, that arrogance is their downfall. Take the case of Dennis Rader, the BTK killer. For 30 years, he evaded capture. He toyed with investigators, sending them cryptic letters describing his murders in horrifying detail. but his confidence blinded him. In 2004, he sent the police a floppy disk containing a message. He thought he had deleted all the identifying data, but he was wrong. Investigators retrieved hidden metadata from the disk, linking it to a computer at his church. And just like that, the game was over. Or look at Ted Bundy. After escaping police custody twice, Bundy thought he was invincible. He fled to Florida, where he went on a killing spree, attacking a sorority house filled with sleeping women. But this time, he got sloppy. He left witnesses. He left fingerprints. His reckless overconfidence led straight to his capture. And then there's Israel Keyes, one of the most terrifying serial killers in modern history. Keyes was careful. He had no pattern, no clear connections between his victims. He buried kill kits across the country, sometimes waiting years before using them. But in 2012, he broke his own rules. He kidnapped Samantha Koenig, a young woman working at a coffee stand. Instead of following his usual method, choosing random victims in different states, he took someone from his own town. And even worse, he used her ATM card, allowing police to track his movements. If he had stuck to his usual careful methods, he might still be out there. But every killer eventually gets too confident. They make one mistake too many. Some don't just deceive their victims, they deceive the world. But the truth always catches up. Take Scott Peterson, who we talked about earlier. Before his wife's body was found, he went on national television pleading for her safe return. He played the heartbroken husband, saying, "I just want my wife back." But behind the scenes, he had already moved on. When police arrested him, he had bleached his hair and changed his appearance. A large sum of cash, a map to Mexico. He was never planning to stay and grieve. Or look at Chris Watts. He stood in front of cameras begging for help in finding his missing wife and daughters. He acted devastated. He wore a concerned father's mask. But when police pressed him, his story started to crumble. And in one of the most chilling moments ever caught on camera, he was seen laughing and joking just hours before his confession. These killers thought they could manipulate the world. But the truth always finds a way out. What happens when a liar is finally exposed? It's not always dramatic. Sometimes it's not a big revelation or a DNA match. Sometimes it's something small. A tiny inconsistency, a slip of the tongue, a mistake that cracks the whole story apart. Take Jodi Arias, for example. She claimed she had nothing to do with the brutal murder of her ex-boyfriend, Travis Alexander. Then she changed her story. First, she said she wasn't there. Then she claimed it was a home invasion. Finally, she said she killed him in self-defense. By the time she settled on her third version of events, no one believed her anymore. Or Casey Anthony, who claimed her daughter was missing for a month before investigators found out she had been partying the whole time. A single Google search for chloroform on her computer was enough to unravel her lies. Then there's John List, the man who murdered his entire family, left behind a chilling letter explaining why and vanished. He successfully lived under a new identity for 18 years. But his face was recreated through forensic aging and aired on America's Most Wanted. A former neighbor recognized him, and just like that, his secret life was over. Because no matter how well a killer hides, no matter how carefully they construct their lies, the moment of exposure is inevitable. And when the truth finally comes out, it's devastating. What can we learn from these killers? If there's one terrifying truth, It's this: deception isn't always obvious. The most dangerous people are often the ones who seem the safest. Think about it. Ted Bundy was a law student, a volunteer at a crisis hotline, and a well spoken young man. John Wayne Gacy threw neighborhood parties, performed as a clown for children, and was even honored by his local community. Chris Watts was a loving father until the truth unraveled. No one suspected them because they knew how to wear the mask. That's the biggest lesson. They all made mistakes. The ones who were caught. They slipped up. They got too confident. They left behind evidence. But what about the ones who didn't? What about the killers who never made a mistake? How many have walked away, their crimes undiscovered? And worse, how many of them are still out there? Because for every murderer who gets caught, there are others who stay hidden. And that brings us to the final question. Now, I'll leave you with this. How many people have gotten away with it? How many killers have walked free because their deception was too perfect? Because if the killers we've exposed today had never made mistakes, would we ever have caught them? Think about that. For every headline-grabbing case, for every Bundy or Rader or Peterson, how many more have slipped through the cracks? How many are still living normal lives, blending in with their neighbors, their coworkers, maybe even their families? That's the most chilling thought of all, because the scariest monsters, they don't hide in the shadows. They walk among us.